I'm very honored to introduce our next speaker, Tonya Allen. Tanya was named one of the 100 most influential women in 2016 by Crain's Detroit Business and the 2015 Michiganian of the Year by the Detroit News. Tanya is one of U of M's most accomplished, civic-minded alumni, dedicating her life and talent to improving the circumstances of Detroit's families. Born and raised in Detroit, Tanya attended Cass Technical High School. Is that East Side or West Side? Central, okay, there you go. And went on to earn her bachelor's and dual master's degrees at the University of Michigan. Last year, we were thrilled to present Tanya with one of our University of Michigan Bicentennial Alumni Awards, recognizing her leadership in creating solutions for the challenges faced by children in Detroit. In her current role as president and CEO of the Skillman Foundation, Tanya oversees initiatives focused on enhancing opportunities for Detroit kids. She believes that such opportunities are essential steps to secure a better future for the city and its citizens. To achieve real change, Tanya argues that there must be difficult, intentional dialogue and thoughtful, persistent action. As she has said, our Detroit is hard work and heart work. Please join me in welcoming Tonya Allen.
Hi everyone. It's good to see everyone, kinda. I want to thank President Schlissel for that wonderful introduction. I also want to thank him for embarrassing me. If you know me, you know I'm always working up to the last minute. So thank you for that. I want to thank Janelle Simmons. I appreciate the invitation. So happy to be here. And then lastly, I want to thank you all because at some point or another, you saw my name on the agenda and you stayed. So always grateful for that. So I know you've heard a lot of amazing speakers today, and it's my hope that I will be able to just raise many of the issues that you've been talking about, thinking about, and listening to, and that there would be some resonance in the lessons that I want to talk to you about, that they would feel like they're right. But maybe I can help you in a little bit shift and change and tilt a few of those things to do your work in a different way, or to strengthen your work, or double down on the things that are working well. I really want to focus on what does it take for us as a community to really leverage the intersection of the interconnections of research, practice, and policy. So the conversation in my mind shouldn't just be in this room with just 200 or 300 of us. It has to be expanded. We have to be talking about these things more broadly, and we have to figure out how to create a safe place where people feel like they can say tough things to each other, but also where people feel safe enough to listen to tough things and come to a common understanding and a common understanding and a common narrative about where we go together from here. So with that, I would just encourage you, if you tweet, let's figure out how to push these conversations forward. I'm sure there's a hashtag for the conference. I want you to know my handle is @Allen_Tanya. Feel free to use any of these hashtags. She's so cute, she's so smart, or her shoe game is tight. So before I really get started into the content, I want to just talk about a couple of things. Well, let me just ask you a couple questions, because maybe that will help us set the tone for the talk that I want to provide. So the first question, and I actually want you to respond with a show of hands. How many of you decided to get into social change work because you wanted to make small, incremental, and slow change? All right. How many of you decided to get into social change work because you believed you could tilt the world to be a fair, more equitable, and sustainable place for all? Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you all answered that way, because otherwise this would have been a really awkward speech. So I want to tell you, I'm so glad that you responded in the way that I was hoping you would respond, because that means that you're my people. I'm a tribal woman, I like to say. It means that I'm always looking for the people who like to get into good trouble. And I don't know if you know, John Lewis, our congressman, talks about this notion of good trouble. And he describes it as good trouble is finding a way to get in the way, to get in the good trouble, the necessary trouble. Good trouble is about doing the right thing, even if it's inconvenient, it's uncomfortable, and good trouble always takes courage. We have to do this if we want to save a little piece of real estate that we call Earth for the generations who are yet born. I also love that he talks about good trouble as having a moral obligation, a mission, a mandate when you leave here to go out and seek justice for all. So with that, let's start with Detroit. Despite moving out from under financial review this week, you all know this better than anyone, Detroit is still at a crossroads. We have supreme growth and energy that's occurring in our downtown and midtown area. Young talent, commerce, and investment is being attracted to these areas in ways that many of us never could imagine. The wave of growth is marked by new ideas, energy, and entrepreneurial spirit and momentum. However, our neighborhoods are struggling with unparalleled despair. Residents bear the burdens of a broken city as they work hard to stay and hold it together. They aren't experiencing the viral energy of newcomers. Instead, their energy is being exerted to maintain what they have and what they remember. And they're constantly being cajoled by the memory of what's been lost. So there's this challenge before us. It's a challenge to dissolve this kind of downtown versus midtown, or downtown versus neighborhood, or this to Detroit notion or narrative. We have to bust that dichotomy up. We got to retire the crisis narrative and the way that that only focuses on deficits, and make sure, and the values are assets, and make sure that we're actually talking about what we have of value, what is really within our own DNA, and celebrate who we are with a new narrative. If we're going to be a successful city where we all can prosper, and where equity will exist, where justice will reign and love prevails, we're going to have to adopt an Our Detroit framework. And I'm going to give you a few tips about how we do that. But before I do, I want to just give you a little bit of context of how I see Detroit in the life frame of our city. For some of you, it may be really difficult to imagine that Detroit's recovery is possible or will be as robust as places like Seattle, New York, San Francisco, Boston, or even Washington, D.C. If we go back 40 years, many of us can recall there were things like the last one in Seattle, turn off the lights, right? Many of these places had deep blight when you think about what was going on in New York City. But we know whether these places are today. Today, these same communities have recovered in a real robust way, and they're now the hotbed of our nation's economy. And I would suggest to you that Detroit, too, in the next 30 years will be one of the hotbeds of our country's economy. If you look at places like DC, just 15 years ago, was in bankruptcy, had the highest murder rate. Now DC schools are thriving, its economy is thriving, and the crime has decreased. The crime is almost near 50, not that I'm celebrating 50 murders, but at one point it was as high as 400 in an annual year. So I want to just say, to create our Detroit, we have to understand what the possibilities of Detroit is. And that means that we have to make an intentional and focused generational play. And when I say generational play, what I really mean is a generational play, that what we do today is really about what we will be able to accomplish and establish for our children and our children's children in the city of Detroit. We need 10 years of collective action to focus this agenda. And many of you might think it is really tough in Detroit right now. None of us can spare 10 years, especially the children, and especially the people who are living in these broken neighborhoods. I would agree with you, but if you're over 30 years old, you know that 10 years goes really fast, right? And I also just want to remind you contextually, right? Between the time of the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott and the 1964 Civil Rights Act, there was only 9 years between that time. It was a tense time, it was an emotional time, but it was a meaningful time. And so I want to tell you a little bit about what I think it takes for us to get to that Our Detroit frame. But before I do, I want to set up four thoughts maybe for you, just to tell you how I think about this word. One, and when I say we, I mean really we, all of us, we're punching below our weight class. We're punching below our weight class. Second, none of us are as smart as all of us. That when we could bring all of this brilliance together, we can solve problems in ways that we never believed before. Third, alone, we are enough, but together we are plenty. And then the fourth is that we are more than enough if we exert our collective power and influence. And I think that's the challenge before us, and that's the challenge for the university, which I am so grateful that our president has put us on a path to try and answer. So here are the lessons that I would offer to you from my 2-decade-long career in Detroit, which I want to make sure you all know includes a lot of failures, a lot of stalled activity, but it also includes a lot of miraculous successes because we were persistent, we were diligent, and we were collective. And so I want to tell you a couple lessons from that. So the first one I've already kind of tipped my hand on, that this is generational play. This is a moment where we must have unprecedented change, which requires unprecedented behavior. Which will create unprecedented opportunity and have unprecedented impact. This is legacy work. It's not for the faint of heart. And as the president said, I'd like to say it's hard work and it's heart work. You can't serve the people. I mean, you can't save the people if you won't serve the people. You can't lead the people if you choose not to love the people. So we have to stop grieving for what was and begin grooming for what will be. The future is coming. The future is coming. The future is coming, and we can create it. Second lesson, and I know all of the researchers are going to like me as a result of this. We have to be data-driven. But data cannot be past tense. It cannot be analog. It cannot be an autopsy. We can't have this retrospective look. We have to be working with quickness and with fierceness in real time, using data to help define, refine strategy and performance. Data must inform us. It should not define us. And data cannot be used in an elitist approach. As researchers, as practitioners, as policymakers, we have to remember that communities are not petri dishes. We also have to remember that you should not be an elitist with data, meaning that we love to go to community to collect data. However, we spend very little time having community analyze data, assess data, and interpret data so that we have a different and a new understanding of what is happening in places that doesn't just come from an external viewpoint on what we see as intellectuals, practitioners, et cetera. The third lesson I would say is don't be intellectually and relationally ghettoized. And what I mean by that is that we can no longer operate in silos. There is more than a duopoly of thought. And we have to hold our tribes. Like I told you, we are tribal. I'm a tribal person. I don't know if you're tribal, but I'm tribal. And that means for me, I have to hold my people accountable if we are acting in a way that doesn't allow new learning to happen or for us to be able to listen to new people. If I'm not expanding my relationships, listening to people that I like and people I don't like who have different experiences than me, then I am falling short of the mark. One of the key findings I found in our work at the Skillman Foundation, we're so inclusive. We talk to everybody that likes me. But when I decided that I was going to get outside of that bubble and actually talk to people who didn't like me, to people who were my opponents, people who were fighting against the things that I were fighting for, or maybe we were fighting for the same goal, but we had different methodologies of getting there, that's when I actually began to understand a broader view of what it needs to happen. And I love this quote that says, "No person is your friend who demands your silence or denies your right to grow." A lot of time when we think about this kind of identity politics and respectability politics, we are putting ourselves in boxes. We will not allow ourselves to think, hear different people or different ideas outside of what we have defined as right. And we have to move beyond right, beyond our own right, until we can get to a collective right. We have to create choices for our change, and those choices can avoid a zero-sum situation. Fourth lesson, diversity and equity is king. I love this definition of diversity because it's the simplest one, and I like simple. That is, diversity is when you count the people. Inclusion is when the people count. And we have to move to make sure that we're focusing on inclusion, that people are counting, that we really want them to feel like they can sit at the table and not just at the table in a folding chair. We have to make sure that people are at the table because they belong at the table. I often talk with young people. I was like, my goal is to get you in the room. My goal is to get you to get your ideas in the room and to make sure that you're contributing to solutions in the room. The other part of my goal for young people is that when they're in the room, they're not questioning whether or not they belong in the room. Lesson 5, we have to build a civic muscle. Now, some of you may have heard me talk about this, but I am very passionate about it because I really believe this is true, is that when you find people who are working on an issue, despite if they're on different sides of an issue and they have different ideas about how you solve a problem, in most cases, you can agree on 70% of whatever it is that needs to be done. And then there's a 20% that we can negotiate on. We can get into the nitty-gritty of the work and we can decide and figure out like what things we can live with and what things we don't have to live with. And then there's a 10% that we will never, and I mean never, agree on. The challenge is that when we are trying to build a civic muscle, we start with the 10% that we can never agree on and never get anywhere. I believe that we have to turn that formula around. We have to focus on 70 and work as hard as we possibly can to get to 90. And then if we do that, and we're bringing people along in trusting relationships, because change only happens at the speed of trust, we're going to build a civic muscle. And the goal for us in Detroit is not just to build a muscle and to let it atrophy. We have to keep working that muscle over and over again until we have the capacity to make the generational play. We have to have this kind of muscular civility. And that civility must include, in my mind, two things: context and content. So I think a lot of times when we're trying to solve problems, particularly depending on where you're coming from, it usually, and this is a generalization, don't beat me up about it, If you're coming from community, you're talking about context. If you're coming from academia, usually you're talking a little bit about content, right? Both of them are important. But neither of them is sufficient. In education reform, I often think about this is that you have one group of reformers that are arguing content, the other group is arguing context. Content in education reform without context is strident, singular wins. We don't move the big needle. We don't move population level data. We move data for small groups. And context without contents is sometimes righteous stagnation. We are right, but we are not improving. And I believe it's the magic of both content and context that really helps us solve the hairy, difficult, and hard dilemmas that are in our community. And I often think about this one quote which says, the most dangerous thing that a species can do is to misread its environment. All right, lesson 6. We have to have a problem-smashing audacity. We can't just learn. We have to make and create change. We have to be intentional. We have to be focused. We have to put ourselves in the places of people who we're working with or who we're working on behalf. We want to work with their interests in mind. And to me, that means with intensity and an urgency, as if we were trying to solve the problem for ourselves. It requires us to move to adaptive leadership and not just this technical approach. A lot of times we see problems and we create solutions that will solve for the simple symptoms, but will not solve for the root cause. It doesn't bring in all of the things that we talk about when we talk about contents and context. And understanding that sometimes simple solutions don't work for complexity. That we actually have to lean in and be listening and be our authentic self and hear and move and shift and be able to respond immediately if we want to have adaptive leadership. I often say that with adaptive leadership, you have to work in the gray. And I will tell you, the new heroism is in the gray, not the black and the white. And then the last lesson I would offer to you is that we have to build community resiliency. We have to invest in young people. I was at a meeting the other day, and I was talking to some community leaders who are quite established community leaders. If I said their names, all of you would nod your head to acknowledge that you know them. But then I said to them, and this was probably a little mean, forgive me. I said, it's really cool to hang out with all these septarians, but we got to figure out how to get somebody younger than me in the room. And we're not being intentional about the succession of our young people. We have to make sure that young people are in the midst of the things that we're talking about. They are the generation. They are the generation that we're making the play for. They will be the generation that will move that play into the next generation. And so we have to prepare them. We have to invest in young people. And we have to be asset-based. We have to stop concealing our value by using deficit language that talks about our communities as if nothing good lives there, or about our schools as if there isn't pockets of excellence in every single building inside of our city. Now, they're not meeting our goals or our expectations, and we need to hold all of those things, hold all of our leaders accountable, including me, including you, on making the change that we need to create. But we have to do it in a way that isn't enforcing this belief that young people and people who live in broken neighborhoods are broken. They just live in broken places. We have to figure out how to magnify the magnificence of marginalized community. And that requires a culture change. Not just a culture change in communities, but a culture change among us. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. You all have heard that before. I also say that it will eat a logic model for lunch, and we will devour our possibilities for change for dinner if we're not incorporating culture in that and thinking about when we are looking at change that we actually need to bring change management theory into the work. And when I think about change, I'm often focused on the 3 phases of it. To me, here are 3 phases. First, it's impossible. Second, it's difficult. And third, it's done. Change is possible. And I want to tell you, because you're my people, the folks that get in good trouble, that you are the ones we've been waiting on. You are the ones who can make sure that the work is done, that we can get to this notion of our Detroit, and that when we get to the point in 30 years where we're the hotbed of the nation's economy, that we can say, we did it different than Seattle. We did it different than San Francisco. We did it different than Washington, D.C., New York, or Boston. We did it in a way where we did it and everybody was included, and everybody prospered, and everybody contributed. And that's the challenge that we have as researchers, as practitioners, and as policymakers. Thank you. Thanks, sis.
Thank you. I think we have some volunteers who can collect questions that you may have and bring them over to me, and I'll read through them if that's all right.
Yep, that's great. I did mention at the top of this thing that if there were any tough questions, I was going to give them to President Slissel.
I have a question while I'm waiting. Is that okay?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So.
Is it tough?
No. I don't know. We'll find out. So when you're thinking sort of generationally, and you think about institutions of higher learning like U of M, what would you like to see a generation from now the university doing differently or more of than it's doing right now?
Well, the reason I lift up Detroit, and I know that the University of Michigan is a global institution and works across the world to create change. But the state of Detroit and the state of the condition of our city and how deeply it failed was the responsibility of the people who lived in that city, but it also was that who lived and live in the city, but it's also the responsibility of the people who left the city. And I put the university in that as well, in that category. And what I would say is that what I want to see in a generation is actually the work that is being done now, is that we are bringing the university and grounding it in the city of Detroit, not by project, and by project, which is usually the way universities show up with these disparate sets of projects and interests that they're very curious about. But when you bring them together and you knit them together, and that knitting is in alignment with what community wants, and that you're focused on the outcome and intentional change that you want to create, then that's what I would like to see the university do, is shift from your individual interests, which are generally for the common good, but move the common good first and then feed your individual interests second.
Thank you. The next question I have has a bit of a preamble on it. So, as we prepare the STEM leaders of the future, colleges are considering ways to revamp educational pathways to various careers. Can you describe characteristics of strong muscular, civility between engineering colleges and community partners? Sorry, glasses, old. That you have seen or that you would like to see in Detroit?
Yeah, so so you actually have kind of hit a little bit of a issue for me. So here's the thing. We all know who this region is and who this state has been. We've been built on fundamentally on the automotive industry. That isn't who we solely are. But one of the things that is shocking to me is that we actually are not talking about our educational system in the context of what students will need to know in the future and to prepare them for the future of work. And so I have been nudging my good friends over at GM on a couple of things, and also Ford Motor Company. If you go to places like San Francisco or the Bay Area, or even if you go to Pittsburgh, the one thing you can see is some autonomous cars driving down the street. We're the center of mobility. Anybody see an autonomous car driving down the street? No, it's like they are putting them on campuses outside of our sight, outside of our psyche. They are not bringing, we need to bring that technology into schools and through universities where we're really bringing, autonomous cars, artificial intelligence. We need to be investigating what does artificial intelligence and technology mean for the way that we teach our students. I think about when I hear the number that technology is revolving, there's a revolution of it every 18 months. Like it gets smarter and faster every 18 months. And what does that mean for our children? How are we preparing and equipping them for that? How are we preparing and equipping teachers to be able to learn that? Because if we're still focusing as a state, which we are, in Detroit as a city, on how you do the basics, which is reading and writing, we will never catch up. We will never be ahead if we're not figuring that out. And I think muscular civility, in my opinion, for engineering schools have to be about you bringing your innovation, your best work into universities, into schools, into communities, exposing, helping to change the mindset, the view of what the future is going to look like, because you have a better kind of imprint and viewpoint on it than most other people do. And so I would just really encourage you to bring that innovation. We have to inspire innovation. We know that talent exists in these communities. We know it. And we're just allowing that talent to be left and fettered. And it makes me think about a raisin in the sun.
I did get some more questions, but I've also been told we're out of time.
All
I'm
right,
so sorry.
good. That works for me.
Should I sneak in a question?
Okay.
Do I get in much trouble? Okay, so someone was really interested if there are any concrete examples right now that you think are replicable out of Detroit, and that you'd like to see maybe that.
Sure.
And then we have to stop. Absolutely.
All right.
No more questions.
And I could, if I would have been briefer with the questions, so I'll take the blame, the answers to the questions. I would say, the foundation worked on an effort called Good Neighborhoods Initiative, and many community partners in here worked with us alongside on that. It was really a mobilization of our full community, from young people to parents to residents to nonprofit leaders to business leaders in those communities, and engaging municipal and political leaders in discussion about what does it take to create change. That work, which was 10 years long, actually it was 11 years long, we spent as a foundation about $117 million. We leveraged over that 10-year period about $1.2 billion, because it's like good work begets good work. If you're doing good work and you're putting money in places, it actually attracts it. And if you don't believe me, just look at our endowment, right? Or our donors. If you do good work, people want to put money where things are working. And what I would just say about that, I'm happy to dig in details on it. We have multiple analytic and evaluation reviews of that work. But here are some of the results that came out of that. 23% graduation increases. 40% increases in opportunities for young people. 40% decrease in crime. 47% decrease in child victimization. 8,500 kids every summer as a result are getting jobs. And I can go on, and I can also tell you some stuff that we weren't able to accomplish. But the point that I'm trying to make is that when you are intentional, when you are collective, you will see change happen. And it is not an attribution strategy, it's a contribution strategy. And I know that sometimes doesn't work for research, but that's the way change happens.